Hey, I'm Shay Warner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Jon Biermacher about how to profitably manage cull cows. Jon is an economist currently at NDSU, and we are going to discuss everything from selling opens right away, adding value to them, second chances, or replacing them with bred cows or heifers. It's a practical conversation, and Jon really shares some facts and figures that I think you will really enjoy and get a lot out of. With that, let's visit with Jon. Calling all ranchers. If you are looking for a better way to optimize your grazing operation and rev up your bottom line, Noble Research Institute can help. Noble's team of ranch managers and researchers work together to find solutions to your challenges. They don't just give you answers, they can help you understand how to apply their research-tested and field-proven principles on your ranch. Visit noble.org to learn more and browse Noble's educational resources. All right, Jon, it is a pleasure to be visiting with you on the podcast today. I know we've had at least one phone call and a few emails back and forth, and I'm excited about the topic at hand and the conversation we are going to have and share with the listeners.
Yeah, me too. I appreciate the invite and I look forward to it.
All right, so to help the listeners get to know you a little bit more, I'd really like to hear why you bet on the beef industry.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have a few reasons. One is because I like the way ranchers remain confident and positive during difficult times. And there's always difficult times. Even today, there are difficult times, even though market prices are extraordinarily high, the highest they've ever been. But it's impressive to me how they remain positive during difficult times. And what do I mean by that? So, drought is terrible. I've seen this before where we have severe droughts, prolonged droughts, like 2011 comes to mind. And 2011, I was down in the Oklahoma, Texas area, and I worked with a lot of ranchers down there. And the droughts down there, they were horrific. And I saw a lot of ranchers that had to sell their entire herds, then go under. And some of these folks were multi-generational, and some of them that were managing these places were 60, 70, 80 years old, some of them, and just to sit and just watch tears come out of their eyes. And so we have this drought today. It's prolonged. It's been severe. It's also been a function of drought down in Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, down where you have the bulk of the herd. And it's having impacts all over. We've had drought here in North Dakota, South Dakota as well, and people have had to cull their herds. Same thing. You're seeing some of these folks that have had to liquidate everything, and they still somehow remain positive. It's just remarkable. It's so impressive to me. I also like the fact that, especially on the ranch side of the supply chain, handshakes still mean something in this industry. I still see a lot of ranchers that interact with people they buy feed from, they buy hay from, people they sell cattle to, and they operate on handshakes, and that trust is still there. And you don't see that a lot with other industries anymore. You see a lot more contracts, you see a lot more attorneys and things like that. And I really like that. I also like that, the beef industry, especially, the U.S. beef industry is so resilient. And by industry, I mean ranchers all the way to consumers. They have such an ability to adapt to things that aren't in their control. You got biological things that happen on the ranch that you really can't control. You've got weather, you've got all the stuff on the production side, you got the stuff on the marketing side, and there's so much uncertainty on both of it. They're so efficient at adapting. For example, we lost a significant chunk of the national herd, again, due to prolonged drought this last 3-4 years. We've seen so much culling. And so with feeders and the packers, they've made up for it by paying for heavier cattle in the feedlot. So, we're able to supply the same amount of beef products to our consumers with significantly less beef cattle. And so that's a way to be adaptive and resilient. I like that. I don't think we can say enough about our domestic consumers and even our global consumers. But in a way, it's very surprising. I don't think we celebrate those folks enough because they have been ponying up to pay these high prices at the restaurants and at the supermarkets. And they really do like beef products. And they have actually, in my mind, many of our consumers have chosen not to do something to be able to buy beef. They're giving up something because, for a lot of our consumers, incomes, through COVID and some of these other things, incomes for a lot of our consumers have actually fallen in a real sense due to inflation and things like that. And so, yeah, I just, those are the sort of things that I think drive why I really like being in this industry and the people that are in it.
Absolutely. I have not had someone bring up, we need to really thank and appreciate the consumers because, and from your perspective, I mean, it makes sense. They're giving up something else so that they can buy the beef product and continue to do that. And I appreciate you sharing that because I think that's something we all need to remember because I think a lot of us take for granted that we're raising our own beef and it's going in our own freezer. So sometimes, I mean, I'm guilty. I don't always pay attention to what the price of beef is at the store.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually like to go to the supermarkets because I like to go in and kind of peruse prices. And so when I'm there, I definitely go through the meat cases. And so you kind of look down there and you kind of get a wow factor. And for the last few years, and it's like, these prices, they're high. And then again, you also go to restaurants, whether they're that mom and pop sort of cafe kind of in a rural area, or you're in Las Vegas or you're at a Morton's in Chicago, or you're at some of the high end kind of places. Steak prices and other cuts are extremely expensive, and people are paying it. They really like our product, and that's a good testament to them.
Now, also in that response, you brought up culling cows because of the drought. And that's actually what we're going to be focusing on today in the conversation is about those cull cows and kind of what ranchers' options are, maybe what they should consider as far as when to sell them or if to give them a second chance. So, from your perspective, what role do you see the cull cow having for ranchers from a business standpoint?
That's a very good question. First, I would say it's important to note that just the marketing of open cattle at the ranch level on their income statement, it accounts, calls typically account between 10 and 20% of gross revenue for a cow calf operator. And so right now with these extraordinarily high prices, that matters. I mean, it's a big chunk of their income. Now, the opposite of that is the opportunity cost of not having a calf to market is very high right now. Like it's depending on whether or not you're weaning a heifer calf or a steer calf, you're somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,800 per head right now. And so opens matter from an expense standpoint as well in terms of that opportunity cost of lost income. Now, most economists, they don't recommend keeping open cows in their herds. I tend to fall in that camp. There's reasons for that because typically when we do analysis on giving her that second chance, it typically doesn't appear to be economical to do that. And I know that right now people see these extraordinarily high prices and especially places that still have drought, but they've called out, they still have a herd, but they don't have grass for expansion, but they've kind of waited and waited and they've kind of got older cows and they know that they need to start holding back or replacing. And the idea of keeping an open and giving her a second chance, I get a lot of calls right now on that. We've done a study to sort of look at that recently back in the winter. We can talk about that in a minute, but my take on it is I don't like the idea, and I don't recommend keeping it open in the herd for economic reasons. And we could discuss that in a minute again, like I said. But now there are some situations where you can add value to culls. And I've seen quite a lot of work. We did a lot of work when I was at the Noble Research Institute on retaining them and trying to keep sort of put some low cost feed into them, or maybe put them on some pasture. And one, you retain them because at the time when you find out they're open, it's basically at weaning time, and that's when everybody's bringing them to town. And so the season, it's a seasonal low. If you think about November, October, November, December, that you tend to have seasonal low call cow prices. So if you have the resources, you can hang on to them for a little while and get them in better condition and put a little weight on them. And then if you can do that, then over a month or two, the price of cull cows start coming back up. So there's some opportunity to take advantage of a little bit higher seasonal price, but it takes resources, and it's always about resources. And the other thing I would say is up here in North Dakota, wintertime, the resources really aren't there like they are, say, in Texas or Oklahoma or Missouri, where you tend to have more pasture available for most of the year. There's some inclement weather throughout the year, but up here, once winter shows up, it shows up and stays here for a long time. So you don't typically have excess pasture. And then if you're thinking about feeding them hay, or even if it's really low quality, couple-year-old hay or something, if you have it, you still have to have the labor, and you have to have the dry lot space, and so on and so forth. So now some people they'll keep them, especially down in the South. They'll put rested bulls on them, and they'll rebreed them. And there's some evidence through studies that show you can get up to 85% of them rebred. Okay. And some people then they'll take them and they'll sell them as, bred cows, replacements. They'll take them to town, and you can get a higher price for a bred cow than you can an open cow. And so some of the work we've done kind of shows that you can make maybe 25, $30 a head by keeping them, rebreeding them, and kind of selling them that way. But the thing is, if you have 30 head on your operation, which is not unusual, 80% of the cow herds in the United States are 50 head or less. And so if you have 10%, sort of a 10% industrial average on opens, you've got 3-4 cows. And so who's gonna take and use these resources? They're just probably need to take them to town and sell them. So if you can do this in a way where you could put truckload lots, so if you have big herds, if you have 500 cows, now you're looking at maybe 50. And so maybe you can put a truckload lot, and then you can start thinking about that. But if you're a relatively small producer, I would say I recommend just taking them to town and try to get what you can for them.
Marketing your calves each year doesn't have to be a guessing game or settling for the easiest option. Join me this August for a 4-week online calf marketing short course that walks ranchers through what makes calves more valuable, what marketing options are available, and how they can manage risk best for their operation. Most importantly, ranchers will leave this series with a plan and newfound confidence to market their calves for their true value for years to come. Register by July 28th using the link in the show notes. So when you were talking about, economically there are things to consider, or economically it doesn't always, you don't necessarily believe that it really makes sense most of the time to keep opens. What are those economic considerations you're talking about? I mean, I initially think of, what's that input cost or break even of the cow, especially if she doesn't have a calf 1 year and to hold her over. But are there other things you are putting into that calculation?
Great question, Shay. It really is, because one thing that's important to note about economists, economics is really just the study of choices. And so I spend a lot of my time studying choices at the farmer ranch level. And so really what you have is you have a set of choices here. And just one of the choices is to keep her and give her a second chance, like you like to say, right? Give her that second chance. The other choice is to replace her with either, say, a bred cow or maybe a bred heifer. And so you kind of have these choices. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to compare which one's most economical. The other thing I would say, back to your point you made just a second ago about you might get a rebred. We've seen a lot of that where you can get them rebred, but I've seen a study that was done some years back where they were actually looking at this, and keeping they were keeping all their opens, and they were rebreeding them, and they were keeping them in the herd. And they did this for a number of years, and what they found was you might get her bred, that first time to give her that chance, and then the following year she's open again. So there's this sort of likelihood, this sort of probability associated with long-term success after you give her that second chance. And I can tell you, you get her rebred, and then you got to wait kind of a year before you have a calf to sell. So there's a cost of time. And then if you breed her again and you're open again, it doesn't. And so I think there's a pretty good chance that can happen, especially with older cows for sure. And so, yeah, and so what we've done is we've sort of looked at those three choices, and we can talk about that when we want to here. I don't know if that's what you want to do now or.
Yeah, I mean, you can either dive into that, or if it makes more sense to you to talk a little bit more about what that study or project you completed was, you can kind of explain some of that as well.
So again, choices. And it's interesting because right now we're getting a lot of calls. And a lot of our calls are coming from our extension people that's located at the research and extension stations throughout North Dakota and some of the county offices. Those are the ones that are out there. Those specialists, they're out there kind of on the front lines, and they interact a lot directly with farmers and ranchers. And they've been getting a lot of these calls, and they're like, hey, we're getting a lot of calls. There's a lot of people seeing these very high prices, and they're thinking, why not give her a second chance? And the thing is, when you think about high prices, every decision's made at the margin. And so, yes, calf prices are the highest they've ever been, but so are the prices for cull cows. So are the prices for bred heifers. So are the prices for bred cows. So in cases with high prices, everything's high. And it's also true with low prices. When you have an excess cattle through the supply of beef cattle herd in the U.S., you tend to have excess cattle. The prices go down. I mean, they're commodities. So every class of animals got low prices when prices are low, and every class of animals got high prices when they're high. And so with that said, what we did was we compared these three choices. So our sort of base choice was let's keep her and rebreed her. And then we compared that to let's buy a bred 3 to 6 year old bred cow and use her as a replacement. So we would sell an open and then replace her with a 3 to 6 year old bred cow, or we would replace an open with a bred heifer. And so what we did was we accounted for those differences at the margin, and we did this back in late December, and we basically said, okay, we would sell it. So in 2024, in November at weaning, that's when we would sell the open animal. And we got the price for what open cows were selling for at that period. And so that's a source of revenue. And then we went out and said, well, if you rebreed her, you're not going to get anything to sell until 2026. Now, conversely, if you went out and sold your open, you get the revenue, and then you go out and purchase a 3 to 6 year old bred cow. We went to the projected markets. Actually, we had some data at that time because they were starting to sort of sell these bred 3 to 6 year olds, and we got data from the marketplace. And I'm going to look here. And so for the 3 to 6 year olds, we were able to purchase on average, basically, a 3 to 6 year old for $2,900. So you've got this cost of buying her, and then in November of year one, which would be 2025, you could generate roughly $1,733, and that's a $2.95 per pound price for the average between a steer and a heifer, because you don't know which one, so we just sort of took the average. And so you've got the 1,700 in year one, and then in year two in 2026, and we used the projected prices that our livestock marketing people put together for 2026 on average, and you're basically getting another $1,730. So in total, for buying that 3 to 6 year old cow, you're generating $2,417. Okay, and so that's the value of replacing your open with a bred cow. We did the same thing for a bred heifer, and bottom line is we generated $2,297. And so now, and then let me just say what we found for keeping the open heifer and waiting to 2026 where we would get a calf. We only generated $1,763. Now, so what does that say? That says the difference between buying a 3 to 6 year old replacement versus giving her a second chance was $654 per head. And then the difference between giving her a second chance and buying the bred heifer was only $534. There's a $120 difference between those. Now, we understand that there's some of these it's based on projections. And so you never know what the price will actually be. But I would argue that either one of those decisions would be better than keeping an open cow. Like I said, 500 versus 650, both of those are much better than keeping the open cow. And so that's a projection over the next 2 years. And so time really isn't your friend with open cows. And so we didn't look beyond that, because right now we're just trying to come up with an idea for what you ought to sort of do right now. But the model's been developed in such a way where we've turned it into a calculator. We'll be putting it online. And what the calculator does is it allows the producers to actually kind of put in their own prices if they want to. So they can either use NDSU estimates for projections, or they can put in their own prices if they think they have a good handle on what they would be. And of course, you can put in different prices and try to understand how sensitive the results are. And I still will argue that moving forward, you're going to kind of find the same results. If we get more grass in Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, which I believe we're starting to see because of all the rain they've had down there finally, you start expanding the herd, prices will eventually come back down. Now, whether they'll come back down to where they were, for the last peak of the cattle cycle is another question, but they will eventually come back down. But I think these results are going to hold between these three choices. And I'm just going to kind of shut up there and let you respond, because I just went over quite a bit of stuff.
Well, I mean, you sent me the findings of that project earlier as we were preparing for this conversation, but I can't say I was really shocked by what you guys found. But I'm glad you said that your prediction is that these are going to hold, because that was my next question. You did this during a high market where people are pretty giddy about being able to ranch during this time point, but we know it's going to drop eventually.
Right. And so what I would say to that is, yes, it is going to drop. But my point earlier is it's going to drop, but at the margin, all classes of animals are going to drop with it. And so even at these very high prices, right, it pays to buy an expensive replacement. Now, when you have very low prices, I still think it's going to pay to buy these replacements, even though they're going to be priced lower, because they're all connected. All these classes of animals are connected through the supply chain. And so this to me just sort of it sort of justifies and gives validation to some of the other published studies that people have done on keeping cull cows. And there have been quite a few. There have been quite a few that the idea of giving them a second chance. And so most all of them that I think are defendable have found similar results. So, or I should say, we found similar results to what they've done. And people started looking at this in Kentucky, and they looked at it in Texas, and they looked at it, in Kansas. We looked at it some in Oklahoma. So for those choices, now one thing I will say that I know that some producers struggle with, especially producers, and this is true whether it's in North Dakota or it's in Texas or Kentucky or Tennessee. If you have a large herd and they're essentially closed, there is a lot of resistance to bringing in outside genetics into the herd. And I certainly understand that. I certainly do. I know many people that have such herds and they like to keep them closed. They develop their own replacements and so on and so forth. But unusual times can require being able to adapt to something that's not necessarily your norm. And I'm not talking about breeding stock operations. I'm just talking about 500 cow operations where they just like to keep them closed. I've got a friend that manages a herd for an outfit down in Oklahoma, and I think they have 4,000 cows. And I do not believe they are not going to, one, they're not going to keep opens, but at the same time, they're not going to bring in animals from the outside. And so they'll just have to figure that out for their own operation. Now, one thing they've done is they have developed fall calving herds. So they're typically a spring calving herd. And so if you're trying to develop a fall calving herd as a complement, which some people do on a larger scale, I don't think people who have 50 cows are doing this. If you have a large herd, then there are those who are taking their opens, they're retaining them, they're putting a bull on them, and they are rebreeding them, and then those after preg check they find them rebred, they're moving them into their fall herds. And I don't have a problem with that. Like I can see that, especially if you don't have the money to go out and like buy a complete fall herd. So there's always other considerations, but so if you're the 50 cow herd, I think you should go out and buy a replacement.
Yeah, and that fall calving model, I know a lot of people who are starting fall herds in that same regard too, and it's just from that aspect, if you're going to give that cow a second chance, whether she was, I think of ones who were younger, had twins, maybe, nutrition wasn't quite right, or a bull issue, whatever it may be, just making sure that, that is the one and only second chance, so you're not perpetuating infertile genetics. But yeah, I know other people who are doing that.
Hey folks, have I told you about my all-time favorite seasoning? It's called Pluck. Whether I am grilling steaks, making spaghetti, or wanting to add more flavor to veggies, I reach for Pluck. Pluck is not just a regular seasoning mix. It contains beef organs for added flavor and nutrients. It's tasty and a fun way to add more meat to your meals. You can learn more at eatpluck.com and get a 15% discount by using the code SHAYWANNER. That code is spelled SHAYEWANNER. And I will include the link and the code in the show notes.
If you think about this a little bit, Shay, you're not giving her a second, you're giving her a second chance, but not a second chance for the herd. You know what I mean? She's not getting a second chance in your spring calving herd. She's getting a first chance in your fall calving herd. Or vice versa, if you already have, just say, if your herd set up as a fall calving herd, you be giving her a first chance, and say if you're going into also having a spring calving herd. And so in that sense, I think they're still following our most recommendations to not keep her in your herd. There's always all these different things that people can do. but it's hard to model everything.
Well, and like you've kind of spoken to already, it can be so individualistic. What's the size of your operation? How much grass do you have? What are your goals? Are you seed stock or are you commercial? I mean, it all makes a big difference on what choices you have, or even, like you said, adding value to those cull cows. Do you have that lower quality feed that you can put a few more pounds on them and wait a few months?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up too, because you sound like an economist.
I am not. You don't want to know.
Yeah, but I believe you are. I believe most ranchers are, honestly. I really do believe that because most ranchers, I believe, understand what their scarce resources are. They know how much land they have, they know how much labor they have available, right? Whether it's their own labor or even if they can hire some labor, which is getting harder to do. And they know how much, investment capital they can borrow. So the cows themselves aren't scarce. We can buy and sell cows, but it's a lot harder to obtain land. It's a lot harder to obtain labor, and the bank's only going to loan you so much money typically. So knowing what you have, like you're saying, pasture resources. Wintertime in North Dakota, South Dakota, there's not a lot of pasture out there in the wintertime. And so if there is, do you spend it on sort of a cull cow replacement or retention sort of program, or do you use it for your herd? And even that's true even down south. So if you have available pasture, what do you use it to stock, for stocking, or do you use it for something else? And so, yeah, we're always arguing to try to optimize using your scarce resources. And so, in that respect, I would argue you're a pretty good economist based on your comment you just made.
Well, thank you. I think I have a few professors who might argue with you on that, but we're making it work in the real world.
I understand, but honestly, that's really the gist of economics is optimizing what resources you have. And I think ranchers do it really well.
So I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, and we didn't really discuss this before, but do you know what the updated number is for a break even on a cow in the Dakotas?
So there's several sort of types of break evens, but I think if I'm hearing you right, what you're wanting to know is what's the break even price that I have to get for my calves
Yeah, what's kind of that updated number?
for my cow herd to break even. And I tell you, I don't have it in front of me, but right now, for those that have cows, right, it's substantially less than the going price. And so because we're kind of looking at 600, we're sort of looking at $600 per cow profits right now. Now, to put that in context, the 33-year average, based on USDA numbers, for the past 33 years, when you have lows and highs and everything, the net return, including land and labor, is $73 per head. We're at 600 plus. And so I would argue that the break even on a calf, and I'm happy I will find this for you and give it to you, but it's significantly less than the going rate. And that's a beautiful thing because that's what that $600 profit's telling me. But I haven't got that in terms of what that price per count is or per hundredweight or per pound is. If I look here and I'm looking at steer calf weights for a 600-pound weaning weight, the going price for November of 2025 is $3.10. I'm guessing that price could come down to 220 or something, and you would sort of cover all your costs at break even.
John, is there anything else we haven't touched on or you think maybe gets forgotten about in conversations about cull cows?
No, I think we've kind of covered it. I mean, there are enterprises, full blown enterprises, that ranchers are using their scarce resources to actually go up and buy. They're buying truckload lots at a time of cull cows, and they're using their scarce resources not to produce calves, but they're taking opens and they're feeding them. And typically an open cow will have what we call yellow fat, And when you finish out a calf, you finish out a calf out to today, we're finishing them out to 1,500 pounds or something, right? Through that energy finishing process, we turn that fat to white. Most consumers prefer the flavor of the white fat versus yellow. Yellow is typically what you would find in many sort of what they quote unquote grass fed sort of systems. And so they're calling them white cows. And then they're selling truckload lots to the packers, and they can get pretty good premiums for those as an enterprise. And so a lot of them, they'll even take dairy cattle and stuff like that, and they'll do whatever in terms of beef cows or dairies or whatever, and they finish them. Most people don't do that. If you're gonna do it, you got to almost think of it like that. So the truckload thing, it matters. When we were at Noble and we were retaining them, and we were trying to add value to them, and we used to have the USDA graders come in, and we would keep them. They would come in and grade them. We'd weigh them and grade them at weaning, and then they would come down and weigh them and grade them every month, and then we would keep them until like April. So we would keep them from like November to April, add value, put cleanup bulls, rebreed them. We would put low cost diets in them because that institute had 2,000 cows. And so if you got 2,000 cows at 10%, you got a couple hundred opens every year. You actually can put truckload lots, and you can sell them video direct off the farm. You could sell them directly to packers. You can get better prices if you could put truckload lots together. So again, I would come back and say, to your question, there's things that some of these very large producers and ranchers can do that small ones can't. And so most of what we've done is geared towards, I would say, the smaller producer. And that's what I would have to say to that question.
Well, as we wrap up today, kind of a fun, more personal question that I like to ask my guests is, if you could go back to your first 5 years of your career, what would you do differently?
So that's a great question. So one thing I would do, and I believe it or not, I have thought about this a little bit. Economists are notorious, especially production economists like me. We're notorious for throwing cold water on very good ideas. And what I mean by that is, a good idea is really a new production system or a production practice at the farm level. And it can be ranches or it can be farms. But this is also true. It can be factories. It could be like just pure economists that aren't really agricultural based economists like myself, but they're evaluating new technologies at a factory, like through a different production practice. For example, we have engineers that work here at NDSU, and we have animal scientists, and we have plant scientists, and we have these folks that develop these new production practices that maybe they take on a new technology. So we don't adopt a technology, we adopt a practice that uses a technology. No-till's a good example. You don't just buy a no-till drill. You're adopting a seed establishment technology that uses a no-till drill, but it's also got a herbicide management protocols and all these different things, the timing, and so we're really bad about throwing cold water on good ideas, new practices. And especially early on in my career, and I learned this the hard way, is we would just come out and say, well, that isn't going to work. I mean, we would do an analysis and say that just, it's not going to work. Nobody's going to adopt it. And that really upsets these people who are brilliant people, like really brilliant scientists that come up with these new technologies. And so, to answer your question, early on, I wish I would have taken some either courses or some training somewhere in diplomacy. And so I could learn how to warm that water up. And so, yeah, early on, I would do these things, and I'd go to this engineer and say, this isn't going to work. And then they would get upset. Now, when I go deliver results, especially if they're not attractive results, Even in this study I'm talking about now, right? We're going back, and there's quite a few of these producers that are wanting to get a or wanting to give a second chance. And we're basically saying that's probably not, going to work. And if you go back and report your results in a way that's not so much the bottom line, it's like, this is what you're going to have to do. This technology is going to have adjustments made so it can perform this way for it to be economical. And what I've learned is that that's a much more diplomatic approach to working with our colleagues so we don't upset them to where they don't want to work with you. Because quite frankly, you have a ranch, if you're going to adopt something, it's got to make you more money than what you're doing now, or why would you ever do it? And it's the same at General Motors. If you go to the decision makers at General Motors and you say, we got a new technology and we ought to use it, they're going to go, well, how much are we going to benefit from using it? And if the numbers don't add up, well, they're not going to use it. And it turns out, more times than not, most of the new practices and systems that are developed by these very bright people don't work. They work technically, they work biologically even, but they don't necessarily work economically. Oftentimes the benefits just don't outweigh the cost of adopting them. And so we won't adopt them. So diplomacy, I think, which I've learned kind of the hard way over the years, we don't teach that to students, and we probably should require a course in it, or I don't even know if you can even get a course in it. But yeah, so diplomacy is my answer.
All right. Well, Jon, I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with myself and share this information with my listeners out there. I think it's a very valuable topic, and I really like how you were able to display the facts and share the different options as you put them for ranchers. So for those of you out there listening, any resources mentioned throughout the show will be included in the show notes, so don't forget to go peek down there and see what else you can learn next. But remember, the best way to support this podcast and your other favorite podcasts is to leave a rating and review, and even better yet, share it with a friend who would find some value in the information. But with that, happy ranching, folks.